The United States began to try to build an atomic bomb in 1939, did not succeed in time to use it against Germany. So that was April of 1945 when Germany fell. And the first test of an atomic bomb was carried out at Trinity in July of 1945. This is a time when Japan was already in significant trouble, but the decision was made to drop the next two bombs that were available. They were being built rapidly on two cities in Japan. There are various vagaries of weather and flights that shaped which two cities were bombed, but they were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Operation Crossroads is what I will call, there's no other way to understand it. It's conspicuous consumption for the purposes of display. So the United States, this is less than a year after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war is over. The Soviets, they know about the bomb. They actually had spies. They knew what the United States was up to. And the Soviets are concerned about this coming arms race. And the United States has taken control of the Marshall Islands, which eventually became a trust territory for the United States through a kind of an agreement with the United Nations. They've taken over the Marshall Islands and instantly identified the Marshall Islands as a potential nuclear weapons testing site. And so this is the first shot of atmospheric weapons testing, and there's a reason that you can find thousands of photographs of Operation Crossroads online. You can see film of it. You can hear many testimonials. It was live on the radio. There were journalists. There were lots of witnesses. And so it was to demonstrate roughly that the United States had more bombs if it needed them. At this time, the US had, I think, about 9 nuclear weapons. And so this was to show that, in a way, that the United States had so many weapons it could waste them, if you will. And so Operation Crossroads was a radioactive disaster. People did become sick from these tests. There was a lot of radioactive waste, but it was a PR success in a way. Immediately, however, as atmospheric weapons testing continued, the problem of fallout emerged as a major global issue, a major global concern. So what fallout does is to create risk categories because of radiation, the potential for radiation to basically cause cancer and to cause contamination, long-term contamination. And after Operation Crossroads, there had been, this is just a picture of a US News and World Report in 1955 of a test in Nevada. There were many tests in Nevada, which was seen as an appropriate testing site in the continental United States. And this atomic cloud over the United States meant that, animals could become sick, individuals could become sick, there could be long-term radioactive fallout. The very worst disaster of atmospheric weapons testing was the Bravo test in 1954. The test was in the Marshall Islands, and it was about 2.5 times as powerful as expected, and the weather systems were not what had been predicted, so that the fallout from Bravo was sucked up into the upper atmosphere, spread all over the world, and indeed almost immediately the fallout from Bravo contaminated, in a famous incident, a Japanese fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon. And the 23 Japanese crew of the Lucky Dragon boat experienced immediate radiation sickness, that is the standard symptoms of vomiting, and by the time they got back to Japan, they were all sick, and one of them was hospitalized, and about 6 months later he died. So the Lucky Dragon incident marshaled significant attention to the consequences of fallout, the immediate consequences of fallout, and the Bravo weapons test as an utter disaster, poorly managed, poorly described, and having global consequences for fallout, really made fallout a major issue by the mid-1950s. So I'm going to show you a series of pictures. One of the things that nuclear planners, this is the Marshall Islands, one of the things that nuclear planners proposed when they thought about where to test weapons And it's almost a stereotype when you look at this material. They proposed that these were places that were both empty and valueless. And by empty, what they really meant is that they were occupied only by people who had limited political, legal, or economic power. So overwhelmingly, nuclear weapons tests were conducted in places occupied by indigenous groups, by tribal groups, by people who were unable to stop them. And this created a form, if you will, of victims of nuclear weapons who don't fall into the standard category of a military victim, but nonetheless, a victim nonetheless, who experienced burns, who experienced exposure to radiation. A historian of these matters, Bo Jacobs, has said that scholars in the wealthy world said that atomic bombs were never used or could never be used. But in practice, they were used all over the world. And he tracked theorizing about limited nuclear war and how it would, what it was supposed to look like if it did occur. And in a funny way, the testing programs, more than 2,000 weapons detonated in the atmosphere over the course of the Cold War, looks a lot like limited nuclear war. So I'm going to show you a series of photographs of places that were bombed, but I've purposely not used historical photographs. I'm using touristic images because I want to capture the beauty of these places that were seen as so valueless and so empty and unimportant that they could be destroyed by atmospheric weapons testing. This is the Marshall Islands, an image of the Marshall Islands. They're now sinking into the ocean because of climate change. But there are 106 tests were conducted at the Marshall Islands, both atmospheric and underwater. But the important thing about these islands is that they were the site of the highest yield tests. So 80% of the US testing yield in the course of the Cold War was detonated in the Marshall Islands. This was a really important site. And it's interesting that those announcing these tests would say it's safe if you're far enough away, but there was tremendous resistance to continuing tests in the United States and even in Nevada. This is the Sahara Desert, Regan, and these are French nuclear tests. The first French nuclear test at Regan took place during the Algerian War for Independence, when France negotiated with the Algerians to take this isolated place in the desert and to begin to carry out nuclear weapons tests. And the very first test, again, as was common, detonated in unexpected ways and resulted in fallout all across northern Africa. Here, as in other cases, the fallout was not just about nuclear risk, it was about the inappropriate presence of France in its former colonial territory. So some of the outrage was about the radiation, and some of the outrage was about France being allowed to do a test at all in northern Africa. So again, a beautiful site with 17 nuclear tests conducted there. 193 tests then were conducted in French Polynesia when the French moved from the Sahara to Polynesia. And here, this is a romantic image of this place now contaminated. The Nevada test site, 100 atmospheric weapons tests, 921 underground tests, every single test, remember, creating waste, creating contaminated, irradiated waste that has to be dealt with. Many of these underground sites are very difficult to manage today. Chitka in the Aleutian Islands, there were 3 US underground tests. There are some amazing photographs of how they carried out these tests, but I haven't included them here. This is the Lop Nur test site in China, 45 nuclear tests. And Maralinga, the Australian test site for the British, 7 nuclear tests. Scholars who have looked at how weapons systems are commonly tested, and remember, when you have a new weapon, it's common to test it to try to figure out if it's accurate, do you have the technology right, have found that nuclear weapons were tested far more frequently than any other military technology. And one way of thinking about it is to think that nuclear tests were both technological, and they were They were ideological. They were propaganda. They showed that you had the weapon. They were, as so many things in the Cold War were, both secret and public. You wanted people to see that you could carry out a test like this. You wanted your enemies to know. And it was a way of being enrolled in the nuclear club if you could do this kind of testing. So this quality of over testing, if you will, in places seen as secret or seen as public and seen as valueless and empty. Nobody's there, but all of the places I've just shown you images of had people living there. They were just people without power, so they were exposed to the risks of these tests.